And this is a lecture sponsored by the School of Information Studies Information Organization Research Group. And we have a speaker, a guest from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His name is K.R. Roberto. I can never pronounce that correctly.
No, you did great.
Thank you. And he's a doctoral student there at the Urbana-Champaign. So, and he's going to give us the talk today. And I don't know very much about him, so I will give the floor to him so he will introduce himself to us. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. I'm trying to be a man of mystery. So, as we said, my name is K.R. Roberto. I'm a first semester doctoral student.
Congratulations.
So, like, please do not expect me to really know what I'm doing, but I can talk. So, so I'm basically, this is like just a tiny baby of my research idea, and we'll see how things shape out in the next several years. But yeah, so today I'm basically going to talk about the way different types of controlled vocabularies, mostly Library of Congress subject headings because it's an easy target, but also a little bit of MASH medical subject headings and some different types of numeric classification schemes deal with, but the first part of the slide said LGBTQ identities, but I decided to swap it out for queer because the presentation is really about how it deals with the last couple letters of that acronym, namely queer and transgender people, and how it does it. So, I'll start out by defining what the terms are. And as I mentioned, I'm talking about queer and transgender, both of which, even though they describe fairly different concepts, can often be used, they run into the same issues of conflation. So, you know, the word queer started out in most prominent usage in like the 40s and 50s as a slur towards gay men. And then when gay activism really came to the fore in the late 60s and early 70s, there were people who reclaimed the term. And in like the late 80s, early 90s, it started becoming a word used for people who had sexual identities that somehow included same-sex, same-gender attraction, and it was a really politicalized term, basically putting a label on something that can't be labeled. It was created in opposition to sort of the words gay and lesbian, which were viewed as being like part of, not the system exactly, but viewed as being assimilative. And so, queer was an attempt, the word was an attempt to sort of sidestep those issues towards assimilation and to be kind of confrontational at the same time. And it's still, the word still carries a lot of that meaning today, but over time, like we'll see the past 15 years or so, it's become an umbrella term. For example, before I was a PhD student mere months ago, it was so long ago. I was an academic librarian at the University of Denver, which is a medium-sized private university in Colorado. And all of the LGBTQ focused groups on that campus were called Queer Something, Queer Faculty Association, Queer University Employees. And it was the Queer Straight Alliance, which was the student group. And did these organizations have queer in their name because they were challenging assimilative gay and lesbian language? No, not really, not most of the time. But they were using that language in an attempt to be inclusive, to cover various letters in the acronym. The other term that we used on that campus was LGBTIQA, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex. The Q was mysterious. It could be queer, it could be questioning. Some places actually break it out into 2 Qs now, which I like, but it makes me think of Scrabble.
The rule of 3 it needs to be.
It's like LGBTIQQ, but it's still pretty cool. And sometimes people also add S for straights, but I feel like, frankly, straights don't really need to be in the acronym because allies is enough. And so, yeah, so the word has been serving a dual purpose for quite a long time now. And the word transgender has sort of a somewhat similar history. It first came about in medical literature in like pre-World War II, but Virginia Prince, oh no, is it Price? I think it's Prince, pretend that I said the right name, is known for popularizing it in the 80s, referring to people who would call themselves transsexuals, specifically male to female transsexuals, but weren't interested in going all the way, so to speak, into having any sort of sexual or gender reassignment surgeries, just sort of changing their outward gender presentation is not a word, presentation and identity to match the gender with which they identify. And so transgender also over time became an umbrella term which included transsexual people, sort of like its earliest use was people who were cross-dressers, and people whose identities were gender variant or gender non-conforming in one way or another. Basically, it became used for people who didn't identify as transsexual, but weren't necessarily cross-dressers either. They just, their inner gender identity didn't mesh up with the gender that other people perceived. And so transgender became a catch-all term. And at the same time, it remained sort of synonymous with transsexual, to the point where people often have to make very clear which of those terms they want to use. And so in that sense, it's constantly shifting. It's not shifting. It's not quite as politicized as the word queer, but it has its moments. Typically, or commonly I should say, transgender is often abbreviated to trans, which it's kind of like Boolean searching. It's like it was trans with an asterisk for a long time. So it's a truncated search for transgender or transsexual, with one S or two. But it sort of became a concept in its own right of just sort of encompassing anyone who's out, whose gender identity didn't match with the gender with which they were assigned at birth. So obviously these words are already messy. So this has probably given you an idea of why catalogers and people who work with metadata are uncomfortable with the terms, because you have to get that item off your desk. So the quickest you can do that, the best. But they haven't always intersected politically, even though their origins and some of their meanings have. For example, I mentioned sort of the rise of the gay and lesbian movement with political activism in the 50s and 1960s, and at that time, people who were transsexuals or otherwise gender non-conforming were pretty deliberately shifted out of the front lines of that movement, because the idea was that rhetoric of, we're just like you, so we look just like you, we have jobs, we wear suits, and we identify as male and wear business suits, we identify as female and wear dresses and carry purses and hats. Well, everybody wore hats. And so so anyone who didn't fit into that wasn't considered politically expedient. So they were sort of shifted to the back lines. But it's gone back and forth. Sometimes, again, gay and lesbian sort of merges back into queer activism. Susan Stryker talks about how, I think especially when this became a political concern for her, so in the late 80s or so, people started throwing around rhetoric of, and I really love this quote, so I'm just going to read it to you. An imagined political alliance of all possible forms of gender anti-normativity. I'm sorry, I should have said that I'm going to incorrectly read the quote to you. And so it's this idea of everyone is sort of misaligned somehow, everyone is kind of not fitting this mainstream idea, so we should all join together and do this activism. But it still goes back and forth. If I may offer an editorial comment, a lot of activism and visibility around same-sex marriage has typically had couples who look just like you, who again are fitting pretty standard mainstream gender norms. If they're both men, they're wearing tuxedos. If they're both women, they're wearing white wedding gowns. They don't, like, you don't see male same-sex couples in the news or on the GLAAD front page or whatever, where someone has a wedding gown on, even if it is even if it could be a really tasteful, nice wig. So it goes back. And speaking of things going back and forth, I figured I would just sort of cut to the chase and talk about the authorized subject headings that Library of Congress and medical subject headings have used historically to refer to LGBTQ concepts and identities. So, before 1946, Library of Congress gave you sexual perversion. So, admittedly, to modern eyes and ears, that sounds kind of thrilling and illicit, and conjures these really exotic, glamorous locales which you would never expect the Library of Congress subject headings to provide for you. But at the time, it wasn't like some exciting gay vacation paradise. It was a very medicalized term, specifically referring to psychological terminology, which was the same thing with mesh, which used sex deviation and sexual deviation. And they started using that in 1963. I couldn't really figure out what mesh people were assigning before 1963. I'm not entirely sure it existed in 1963. Does anyone in the room know?
May I ask you a question?
Yes, certainly. Go for it.
I mean, how did you identify these terms as the one they might have used in the history?
Well, partly I looked at people who had already done this research and just sort of, double-checked them to be like, yeah, that sounds right. But partly also, I thought about terms that, still somewhat thrown around today and decided to track them historically to see what they've been called before. Like, for example, homosexuality. I feel like there is a pretty clear connection between the idea of gay men, lesbians, and bisexual people and homosexuality. Like, it seemed like the concepts are already mapped, so I just sort of traced them down. Yeah.
In lesbian and gay history, especially sort of pre-World War II, there's this the term invert or inversion.
Mm-hmm.
How does that? Was that something that Library of Congress would ever use, or is that just more modern, or not modern, but sort of historical medical language?
I couldn't find a lot. Though, yeah, definitely invert and earnings and all those kind of words did come up. But as far as I could tell, and this has to do with, what the contents are of the Library of Congress's collection. They started out supporting Congress, so I don't know if, the people in the U.S. Congress were just less interested in materials about sexual perversion or deviation before 1946, but this was the earliest I could find. Though maybe I should try to go back further and delve into archives and such. Remember, I've only been in the program for 8 weeks. I'm going to mention every question I get. I'm going to mention that. I'm still lucky I can find my mailbox on a regular basis. But yes,
Along with that, do you think that they're getting more specific as they go along?
they are. Yeah, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. It's kind of a lot of that is, I feel like, is being outwardly driven by catalogers outside of the Library of Congress. Though MESH is also getting more specific and sort of more accurate, and I'm not entirely sure where that's coming from, but since MESH works so differently, I have to assume it's people at National Library of Medicine, people working for PubMed who are pushing for this better, more sensitive terminology. But yeah, so in 1946, the Library of Congress discovered homosexuality as a term. The actual practice had been around for some time before then. And they have still been using it to this day, though it's nowhere near as frequently applied as it once was. And in 1948, it was the same thing with transvestism. And then in 1994, the Library of Congress heard about transsexuals. Though it wasn't until 2007 that the Library of Congress subject headings acknowledged the existence of transgender people, which means that they spent well over a decade basically making anyone, you had two choices. You were a transvestite or cross-dresser. If something was written about you. You were a transvestite or you were a transsexual, and there was nothing else. Failing that, you could always be a gay man or a lesbian or perhaps a bisexual person. But that was it. It was very linear, and it used this pathologized language, particularly the term transvestism, which is something that comes, directly out of APA language, and isn't a term that you hear much in common usage, at least judging by years of, reading things. Maybe, I did some empirical research in Craigslist personal ads to see if anyone was using transvestism. Sometimes they use TV, but, personal ads are all about abbreviation. And MESH, as mentioned, from 1963 to 1980, relied upon sex deviation, and then in 1981, they introduced paraphilias, which is, unsurprisingly, a very medical term. These are headings to describe medical materials, so you sort of expect them to have that clinical sound to them. And so, so for over 40 years now, people have been criticizing this terminology from a number of different perspectives. Some of them, especially early on in the 70s, arguing with this, you're all lumping it under sexual perversion perspective, or you're differentiating, there are no subject headings for heterosexual whatever, but you have subject headings for gay whatever. And so the earliest thing I could find was a presentation done by Joan Marshall and Steve Wolf at the American Library Association annual conference in 1971 called Sex and the Single Cataloger, New Thoughts on Some Unthinkable Subject. And this chapter written, and then so Steve Wolf wrote this title. I would guess that he coined the title in the first place because the title of his chapter in the book Revolting Librarians shares it, Sex and the Single Cataloger. And Joan Marshall also wrote a chapter for Revolting Librarians called LC Labeling and Indictment, which comes at things more from a feminist perspective, but it was the early 70s. These movements were not exactly separate silos from each other. And then I feel like since I'm talking about research that I have done, I should probably mention Ellen Greenblatt, who has been doing this forever. Right? Okay, 20 years isn't exactly forever, but 20 years is a really long time. She has been doing research and presenting on these topics forever since, I think everyone in this room was probably born when Gay and Lesbian Library Service came out, but that doesn't mean everyone in this room, had an MLS at that time and was working as a librarian. So, in 1990, she and Helgoff co-edited a really groundbreaking book called Gay and Lesbian Library Service, and she wrote a chapter basically tracing homosexuality as a concept in LCSH, and so that is a lot of where my research came from, because she's very thorough. And then in 2011, she finally came out with sort of an expanded sequel to Gay and Lesbian Library Service. And it being expanded, it has a much more expansive title, Serving LGBTIQ Library and Archives Users, Essays on Outreach, Service, Collections, and Access. And in that chapter, she basically updated everyone on what she had been doing since 1990. So this is about 25, 26 pages, the second chapter. And then we talk about things that have pretty much popped up in the past 10 years or so. The first and so far only criticism of how intersex topics are classified is by Ben Christensen, and it was published in Ellen Greenblatt's book, The Serving LGBTIQ Library and Archives Users Anthology. Melissa Adler, who just graduated from Madison, presented last year, basically, again, talking about sort of the same stuff. And the title is Paraphilias, which sort of answers your question right there. Oh, and I should mention that for the purposes of these slides, authorized, established subject headings are in all caps, partly because it's easier to distinguish them out of all these words that are floating around the slides, and partly because it kind of looks cool. And so other people have written things. Matt Johnson wrote A History of Transgender Subject Access. Patrick Hilty has been writing about Queer Knowledge Organization, and someone in the room has written some other stuff. I mean, not just this, but we all like this one. This one, I think this article gets cited in like every other article I mentioned on this slide. So this is now, I'm moving from my 5 minutes of historical perspective to sort of describe what these subject headings look like now. And so currently the authorized term is gays, and there are cross-references, by which I mean these are terms that if you search for them using a good information retrieval system, it will bounce you back to gays. So if you type in gay people, it'll say, did you mean gays? Gay persons and homosexuals. So this is still the same language that they have been using, except with slightly more palatable descriptions. And if you should want to not only do research on gay men, but on everyone under the LGBTQ, LGBTIQA, quote-unquote, umbrella, the authorized heading is sexual minorities, which again sounds kind of mysterious and fascinating, but isn't really all that, and I would argue it isn't particularly intuitive language. And so with that, yes, yeah, I know, right? Ground-shattering observations being made right here. I happen to know that the subject heading for sexual minorities came out of the University of Washington. I'm not going to get into this too much, though it's one of my favorite things, but one of the most endearing qualities about LCSH is that other libraries can propose subject headings to the Library of Congress, and LC can then decide whether to have them or not. And so in the past 10 years, 15 years or so, there has been this group which people informally call the gay cataloging mafia. There are no actual mob ties, to the best of my knowledge, but there are a lot of particularly gay and lesbian cataloging librarians out there who have sort of put in decades of research and advocacy into getting additional terminology added. And so the primary hotbed is the University of Washington and also NYU. So when you're planning your LGBT subject vocabulary pilgrimage across the United States, make sure that you hit up both of those places. And so other cross-references are non-heterosexual people, which is accurate, certainly, though it puts the onus on, again, it puts the onus on sexual minorities. I mean, all this language does, it's saying here are the normal mainstream people, and here are you other people over here. And it's the same thing with the term sexual dissidents.
I like that one.
It's great, right? I mean, it's a really, I can't argue that it isn't an attractive phrase, but, this is the terminology that represents, all these libraries worth of knowledge on these topics, and I don't know, maybe you don't want to be like, oh, you're looking for materials on LGBT people, why don't you type in sexual dissidents and then you'll find it. It's an act of Congress. And so this gets messier. I mean, the more you look at this, the more crazy it gets. One thing you may have noticed in those slides is that the word queer is nowhere to be found on them. So even if you are a non-heterosexual sexual dissident who is a sexual minority, you are not going to be queer as far as Library of Congress is concerned. Of course, Library of Congress subject headings being what they are and being that so many people are involved in their creation and maintenance, there is an authorized heading for queer theory. And so when I first found this out, I don't know, several years ago, I was like, okay, so if queer theory exists, what is queer theory studying? Because there's no referent. The answer is, of course, that it's studying sexual minorities and has some sort of relationship to the subject heading gender identity, which I haven't really figured out. I was about to say this would make a good dissertation for someone, but maybe it will make a good dissertation for me. And as previously mentioned, cross-dressers are always transvestites in LCSH. And Library of Congress subject headings have these things called scope notes, which are there to assist catalogers to figure out what the term means and how to assign it. And so the scope note for transvestites is, Here are entered works on persons, especially males, who assume the dress and manner of the opposite sex for psychological gratification. As I mentioned in my earlier Craigslist perusal, and all I can say is, based on this evidence that I have so far, there is not a whole lot of psychological gratification being looked for within the people who refer to themselves as transvestites and cross-dressers, at least on Craigslist. And this really sort of starts to fall apart when you talk about drag performers. So you are probably not surprised at this point to discover that drag kings and drag queens are not authorized terms, right? That would be too much like common usage. And so the authorized terms are female impersonators or male impersonators. And so, just like transvestites, there's a scope note for female impersonators, kind of breaking it down for you. And this terminology is used for works on men who impersonate women, generally for purposes of entertainment or comic effect. And women who impersonate men for purposes of entertainment or comic effect are male impersonators. So basically this says female impersonators are men who dress as women for, like, you know, for hilarious results. And male impersonators are women who dress as men for hilarious results. This gets messy. So here is one example. This is a group. These are some members of a group in Denver called the Denver Cycle Slugs, and basically they dress up, you know, a little more fancily than they normally would, and, you know, put on wigs and put glitter in their facial hair and lip sync things. So this is, if you asked them, they would not define themselves as female impersonators. I mean, unless unless there is some common tenet of women who look like Bigfoot and wear their underwear out the outside that I don't know about. I mean, they're pretty solidly drag queens. And then there's also a group of people known as faux queens. And so these are people who were assigned female as birth, live as female, presumably have always lived as female, but like dressing up as drag queens because, you know, it's a fun time. And so these would basically be considered female impersonators, which really blows this whole idea of men dressed as women for entertainment or comic effect entirely out of the water. I mean, if someone looks like this woman here on the left is named Holy McGrail. If Holy McGrail gets on stage and starts lip syncing and people give her money, you know, are you going to go up there and snatch her off the stage and tell her that she is not a man dressed as a woman for entertainment or comic effect? I mean, you could, but I don't think it's going to end well for you if you do so. And so male impersonators is messy. The authority record for this subject cites Wikipedia at some length, and Wikipedia would like you to know that drag kings are basically they're lesbians or they're transsexual men who dress in masculine drag, but that the term can also be used for women who are temporarily passing as men, also known as passing women in some feminist texts, and women who wish to present themselves in a masculine gender role without identifying as a man. One thing that is really interesting when you look at the documentation cited for female impersonators and male impersonators is that the vast majority of the documentation they quote uses the term drag queens or drag kings, and so they're citing this to tell you that you should use female impersonators, male impersonators. So it's really interesting. It's sort of like cognitive dissonance every time you look at a Library of Congress subject heading. And so, you know, since we're at this point in the presentation, there's a pop quiz. Of course, there are no drag kings or drag queens in subject headings, but there are drag balls. And of course, this heading has a scope note to tell you how to assign it. So who goes to the drag balls? Is it A, female impersonators, B, transvestites, or C, gay men or lesbians dressed in clothing characteristic of the opposite sex? If based on your perusal of the LC subject headings you chose A or B, you are incorrect. So it's like, you know, the more you look at this, the further it falls apart. And I just want to mention that this note is particularly problematic given because it is about drag balls. I don't know how much any of you know about drag ball culture, but typically the participants don't always identify as gay men or lesbians dressed in clothing characteristic of the opposite sex. You have a couple of different categories going on. You have, for example, butch queens, and you have femme queens. So butch queens is a term in ball culture used to describe people who are usually but not always gay men who haven't started hormone therapy, meaning they aren't taking estrogen, they aren't living as female in any other part of their lives, but they are dressing up and performing. So that's a pretty, which meshes to a certain extent with sort of a more mainstream definition of drag queens. Like the people you see on RuPaul's Drag Race are going to be butch queens, though they vary in levels of presentation and realness, meaning wanting to present as feminine. So, like for example, the term always makes me think of Paris is Burning, which is this documentary chronicling ball culture, and they say, butch queen, first time in drags at a ball, which I think gives you a pretty good idea of who's dressing up in the butch queen categories, people who haven't done drag before. And then femme queens are usually people somewhere on the sort of transsexual woman spectrum, like they've started hormone therapy and are living in female in some part of the rest of their lives. So, according to Member of Congress subject headings, femme queens aren't even female impersonators. I mean, how can you be a female impersonator if you are a female being female? They're more like faux queens if they're anything. Their motive in presenting is about realness, not meaning being perceived as female, because if you live as female, you're female, right? No, there's no real ifs, ands, or buts about it. But for being perceived as a heterosexual female. So realness is about presenting, it can be class and race drag to a certain extent. So it's like you are beyond a gay man dressed up. You have entered into this whole different zone. So, any words about them get drag balls. Do not try to identify who participates in them. I'm talking way too long, so I'm going to go faster. So the Library of Congress classification has a lot of interesting things going on. Gay and lesbian topics, for example, range from HQ 75 to HQ 76.965, which is a lot. It's really long. You may not realize quite how long it is, but imagine all these different decimals in here. Transvestism gets 76.97 to 77.2. If you do any math and realize that LC classification typically gives you those 2 points past the decimal, that gives you, this is like 4 numbers. And transsexualism is a little better, but not much. And so the parts of the LC classification scheme that indicate what topics go where are also fleshed out, and here are a couple examples for you. So gay and lesbian culture has all sorts of cool things going on. There's HQ 76.85 for gay conservatives. There's HQ 76.965.G38 for pride parades. There's a similar number in HQ 76.965 for handkerchief codes. Point H something, H3, I don't know, 6. I can cut her off the top of my head, look at that. And so those are really fleshed out because of all these years of advocacy that catalogers have done. And this is what you get when you talk about cross-dressers and transsexuals. You get biography, collective or individual, and you get that catch-all phrase, general works. I was looking at this last night and I was kind of excited to discover that HQ 77.965 is now specifically mentioned in the LC classification documentation, and that is where you class works about transphobia. So, that's pretty cool. I mean, it's depressing that there are enough works being written about transphobia that is the one salient characteristic of this entire identity that gets its own specific mention. But, it's a step, right? We won't discuss how big a step it is. And so I said that I would mention mesh. MESH has this classification concepts known as trees, so it's like a hierarchy, goes from broader to shorter. And MESH puts sexual orientation and gender identity under mental disorders and under sexual and gender disorders. You see here that paraphilias, that term you may remember from earlier, breaks out even further into such delightful terms as pedophilia, sadism, and transvestism. Good news for our cross-dressing friends who are pedophiles and sadistic. And transsexualism has its own little separate thing. But you know, all is not lost. So here are some examples of the gay cataloging mafia doing their good work all over the Library of Congress subject headings. So here are some improvements. There's transgender people, 2007. Intersex people, which was, it wasn't created as a concept in 2007, but the previous term had been hermaphrodites and all those variants. And so someone realized that hermaphrodites was incredibly insulting language and changed it to intersex in 2007. There's internalized homophobia. A new one, I was also kind of excited and depressed about this one, transphobia in medical care, which goes along with the subject heading for transphobia, which explains why there is an assigned classification number for transphobia, because a lot of times when you're proposing a new subject heading, you want to go that extra step and propose a classification number for it as well while you're at it. So HQ 77.965 exists thanks to a gay cataloging mafioso. And then these other two I kind of threw in just because it's impressive where controlled vocabularies can lead you. There's uncircumcised men as a subject heading, and for these terms you're supposed to cite the works you were cataloging that offered this term to you, and sort of you have to justify their existence. And this is one of the few terms that I know of that cites gay porn as where it came from. For a number of years, the Leather Archives and Museum in Chicago had sort of guerrilla catalogers. I mean, they're mostly librarians who had real day jobs as catalogers who would also dabble in the Leather Archives and Museum collection at the same time. And they would propose lots of subject headings, like they're the ones responsible for strap-on sex. Interestingly, uncircumcised men did not come out of the Leather Archives cataloging mafia. It came out of Northwestern University. Feel free to wonder why it came out of Northwestern University. I don't really know, except that it's nice to be a cataloger with a day job where you can cite interesting things all as part of a day's work. As I mentioned, the heading for strap-on sex does not mention porn in any of its citations or claims of literary warrant. But it does mention Wikipedia, which might be the same thing. Sometimes. And then I was looking at MESH, and they are also up in there. They have now created descriptors, which is how they tend to refer to their headings, because they're constructed in a different way from LCSH. And these are new for 2013. Yes, they already know what they're going to be using next year, even though this year has not ended yet. So there's transgender persons and health services for transgender persons. What I find most noteworthy here is that even though this is language, for the health sciences, for the medical industry, the description is actually more accurate and sensitive than what the Library of Congress subject headings say. And so they describe transgender persons as persons having a sense of persistent identification with and expression of gender-coded behaviors not typically associated with one's anatomical sex at birth, and with or without a desire to undergo sex reassignment procedures. And then they have a related heading for health services for transgendered persons. This is part of some new descriptors they have for health services for various oppressed groups. There's health services for the aged, there's health services for youth, and this sentence is like so great that I need to read it to all of you. It's about health systems organized to take account of the special healthcare needs of marginalized groups who may face barriers in accessing health services. So that's impressive. It makes Library of Congress look a little bad, though they did establish a similar heading. I don't know if it was the same cataloger doing double duty, but whatever it is, it's interesting. Also, the 23rd edition of Dewey Decimal, which came out in mid-2011, before 2011, the way they dealt with transgender and intersex topics in particular was to just sort of put them in a really vague corner that didn't have any explicit information about what to use. It was another one of these catch-alls. And so they've broken things out and added notes to their decimal numbers explaining how they should be used. And so 306.76, 306.7 is basically a sexual behavior. And so this is just, the thing with Dewey is the longer the decimals get, the more specific the topic should become. And so this is explicitly for sexual orientation, transgenderism, and intersexuality. And it also mentions asexuality and asexuals, which is kind of an identity that is people have been writing about it a lot in like the past 5 to 10 years or so, but this is the only example I could find of any type of commonly used classification scheme explicitly addressing them. And then they break things down even further for transgenderism and intersexuality, and the, like the scope note says, including female to male transgender people and male to female transgender people, which was also the only explicit guidance I could find. I mean, maybe not all catalogers or people working with descriptive metadata of some sort are, know as much about transgender topics as other people do. And so they may come across works that explicitly say transgender people and not know what to do with them, but fortunately Dewey will tell you what to do. Unfortunately, people at the Library of Congress, perhaps recovering from the spree in the mid to late 2000s that led to them approving headings such as strap-on sex and uncircumcised men, have backed away. So this, this collective effort of different libraries submitting subject headings is known as SACO. And they used to meet every week, look at the proposed subject headings, and like just sit around in a room and figure out whether they're going to approve them or not. But like a lot of places, Library of Congress has had attrition, and some of their favorite subject heading specialist people retired, and so now it's monthly. And so this was the first meeting of this year, and a library had proposed butch femme gender identity, which fits pretty neatly under the transgender people umbrella. There's a lot of literary warrant for it. There have been plenty of books and articles written on the topic that use the specific language. I'm sure it has a lovely Wikipedia entry. And Library of Congress was not having it. And this is where things become really worrisome. This language coming explicitly from LC. The meeting feels that the meeting, which is like 2 people in a room, maybe one of them has a laptop, I'm not sure. The meeting feels that the proposal is too narrow and specialized for general vocabulary such as LCSH. Libraries needing specialized headings of this type should consider creating them as local headings rather than proposing them for inclusion in LCSH. The proposal was not approved. To put this in context, they send out email that are minutes of the meetings, and they're typically things like, usually proposals aren't approved because they didn't follow all the explicit guidelines for how to construct that heading or how to present it. It's very rarely based on the content of the heading. So this sets a worrying precedent. I think it was in 2009 that they rejected a similar heading for fisting, for genital fisting and for anal fisting. But butch femme gender identity is a lot more centrist, as it is a considerably less controversial topic than explicit terminology for sex acts. Though please note that strap-on sex lives on forever and ever in the Library of Congress as subject, because they're not going to take it back. They're not going to be like, this is too specialized, we're striking it. They have better, hopefully. They have, again, in a production-oriented environment, there are only so many things you are going to do to reorganize your vocabulary.
But that's a heterosexuality, that's why.
I know. Well, they can be. I heard that there are people who aren't I heard there are non-heterosexual people who do it too.
Uh-oh.
Sexual minorities. And so looking at this stuff, this is what leads me to sort of my big research questions. traditionally, description has this ideal of objectivity, which, has never really happened, because how can you be objective when describing something? Because everyone has their own perspectives and lenses through which they view concepts, and so you can't have true objectivity. Though I would not recommend arguing this in any LS classes, at least at the master's level, usually. I mean, unless I'm teaching. And so, can these lists of vocabularies, the idea is that they're supposed to reflect common usage. This is a very common, no pun intended, argument for Library of Congress subject headings, that they serve to represent the terminology that are already being thrown around. They're not establishing it. They're like a mirror. And so, can you challenge the status quo in library work, in descriptive metadata work, while reflecting common usage? I mean, isn't common usage status quo by definition? And ultimately, should classification attempt to interrogate hierarchies of value and systems of oppression? See, that is my PhD student language that I have picked up in the last 8 weeks. Actually, no, this is week 8 in the past 7 weeks. And so, I don't have any good answers. I would personally argue that yes, it should attempt to interrogate hierarchies of value, because there's this underlying principle that it's supposed to organize all the information and knowledge that could conceivably turn up in a collection. And so, if the language you're using is leaving out huge gaps, even if those gaps are part of society as a whole, you're doing a disservice by not attempting to describe them. So yeah, that's pretty much what I have been thinking about. So I'm out of things to say, but I'll entertain questions.
Before, when you were talking about queer not showing up in Library of Congress, do other slang terms show up? Talking about other minorities and oppressed groups? And I'm thinking sort of specifically about the emergence of the term Chicana in specifically to describe people from California and from the American Southwest in the 70s and
Not
60s
really.
and 70s,
No, it sort of lags across the board. I believe you mean Hispanic American women, to use the current authorized language.
No, but
so yeah.
Chicana is very specific.
Oh yeah, no, I'm saying it in all caps. Like that's what LC subject heading is for.
Okay.
Sorry, it's hard to talk in all caps. But yeah, obviously this is not the one area where Library of Congress subject headings are problematic. You could argue that they do this for all sorts of groups that aren't conceived as part of the mainstream. I would argue.
We've talked about how these names and labels shift, and I think that a lot of the issue in the culture is that there's not necessarily names for some of the things, or they're from the community, as you said. But then, if we're also complaining that they aren't in LCSH or they're in a different, I think maybe something to think about is, do you want to name some of these things? And when I say some of these things, that sounds insulting, but some of these concepts.
Yeah, it's like, do you want to sell out to the system?
Well, yeah, and then that also then puts them in a box too. And if they're by nature shifting, and that's kind of what I imagine queer to be covering, is of shifting things that don't necessarily, they're not going to be put in a pigeonhole.
Yeah, it's a really good point. How do you describe something that resists description?
Right, exactly.
And I don't have any
that's
good answers.
the problem with classification. So
right.
You have to compromise in some way, but it seems to me that your question is what does the compromise mean to the people being?
Yeah, exactly. Part of how I got interested in this research area was from working as a cataloger in an academic library and having these materials that I had to assign subject headings for, and being like, wow, these headings are only connected by the thinnest of layers to the content of these works, and so it was really unsatisfying. And there are ways to get around that when you're describing materials. But
and I think something I really liked about Christensen's article is that he talked about what the consequences are of where you're putting things, but then keeping in mind that people who are classifying this stuff don't always know,
Well, yeah.
they don't have necessarily always the full.
Oh, sure. I mean, nobody knows everything about everything.
Right.
I mean, you kind of have to be a dilettante
Yeah.
to classify materials, which is one reason that I like some of the explicit language that, the newest Dewey scheme uses and that now Mesh uses, because it takes these words that pop up a lot, that would be considered keywords in a different context, and gives you somewhere to put them. I mean, you could apply, like, for example, I don't know a whole lot about chemistry, but, I used to get paid to catalog really obscure chemical books, and so I would just be like hoping that one of the words in the title would have a subject heading in there, and like, it's like, digging for a needle in a haystack and doing up with this one.
Thank you very much, Karen.
Thanks very much.